I will begin. And we are now live online, I understand. E nā mana, e nā waka, e nā reo, e rā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this event, the launch of the NZIER Helen Clark Foundation discussion paper, Pathway to Prosperity, Helen Clark in conversation with Paul Polman. I'm Wayne McNee, I'm your MC for today, and I'll be trying to keep us to time, so it is a tight timetable, so appreciate everybody's patience as we work through that. I'll begin the event with a karakia. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa, homi e, hui e, tai e. So a little bit of housekeeping. So if there is some kind of event, the alarms go off or whatever, the staff are going to come in, the staff are going to come in and show us where to go, where the exits are, etc. And the bathrooms are just out there and to the right. So welcome to everybody in the room. It's a great turnout. In particular, the Right Honourable Helen Clark and those online. This is a live streamed webinar. Thanks also to Stephen Sutton from Russell McVeigh for hosting this event. This NZIER paper is an important piece of work covering a critical topic for the food and fibre sector and therefore the New Zealand economy. The first part of the event today is live streamed and recorded. There's a Q&A function, so you can ask questions online and you can also vote on others' questions for Paul. Those questions will be asked after Helen and Paul's conversation, time allowing. This is a public webinar and will end at 8:30 a.m. So I would now like to introduce the Right Honourable Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, patron of the Helen Clark Foundation, who will introduce the Foundation and the reasons this work was commissioned. Thank you, Helen.
Well, thank you, Wayne, and good morning, everyone, at this very, very early hour. I think a number will be familiar with the Helen Clark Foundation, which was the brainchild of my husband, Peter Davis. It's about evidence-based policy in the sort of spectrum of the sustainable development space. And cutting to the chase, the reasons for commissioning this report were really to have a fresh look at an old New Zealand problem, which is our champagne tastes of the beer income. We don't earn enough. I used to recall looking at, imports and exports as PM. We used to import a lot of high-tech stuff and export a lot of barely processed stuff. And in the end, it doesn't really quite add up for supplying the kinds of needs we have from all sorts of things in New Zealand, to put it bluntly. So the report sets out to look at, as it says, pathways to prosperity. We can all say what the problem is. The issue always is what to do about it, because you're dealing with private sector. Government doesn't command the private sector, but governments can send signals, they can encourage, they can do various things that shape things. But then on top of the old challenge, as it were, and this is something Paul Polman will very much speak to, is that we're seeking to export food and fibre into a world which is increasingly responding to what's happening to climate and biodiversity ecosystems. And if we don't have our narrative right and the substance behind the narrative, we're increasingly going to find ourselves in quite a lot of difficulty. And this isn't a new concept either. I recall being in the UK at a function at Peter Jackson's Marylebone Road restaurant, Providores, with British thinkers in this space when I was PM, and one of them, Jonathan Porritt, son of the former Governor-General, said, "Prime Minister, your economy's stuffed, isn't it?" I said, What? He said, well, you're exporting food 12,000 kilometres around the world, you're expecting people to fly 12,000 miles to get to you, your carbon footprint's huge, how are you going to be able to keep doing it? And of course, that's really the reality that's hitting us now. when I spoke with Paul Polman on the phone the other night getting ready for this, he has plenty to say about what the expectations of the European and other regulators are going to be. So, we've got a lot to do, not just to sustain the incomes we have, but to prosper in this new world that's come at us pretty fast. So, the report is really a way of opening up conversations around these things. Obviously, most appreciative of all the work that NZIER have put into it. Cliff and Susanna Cook supported the production of the paper, and of course R&D, Russell McVeigh, for hosting the launch today. It's very, very, very generous of you. So let me rest my sort of framing comments at that, and look forward to the discussion with Paul and also with the interaction around the table. Back to you, Wayne.
Thanks very much, Helen. So I'll now introduce Todd Kriebel and Bill K. Blake from NZIER, who will give a summary of their paper. I think we've got Paul coming online at 7:50. Is that correct? 15 minutes. You've got about 15 minutes to do your introductions.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Todd Kriebel, one of the co-authors of the paper with Bill. Maybe just a bit more context and scene setting from me. So it just seems like a great opportunity for a couple of think tanks to get together and really think about some of these longer-term stewardship issues outside of the government of the day, because I think that is that stewardship function. We do need to do that, and in this context, it's very much about that interplay between the economic prosperity and the social prosperity. Countries starting out do want to invest and need to invest in health and education for that prosperity, and Helen will know that very well from your UNDP days. But the interesting thing is, even when they've reached that prosperity, they still want to continue investing in health and education, in our case, things like pensions. But to do that, you need to have the economic base to do that. So it really is about that interplay today. We wanted to have this discussion. And the other thing, of course, is the fact that we're up against some global limits of things like climate, and domestically, things like our pressure on land and water. So, again, we've seen that food and fibre sector has been the absolute star performers. They have been the leaders there. There's probably more there that we can do, but also I think some lessons from food and fibre sector for other potential export sectors as well. So, in doing this work, we basically have set out to consolidate some of the body of knowledge that's there, and there is a fair amount of consensus on this stuff, and this stuff really is actually quite hard. We've updated and looked at some of the data, and most importantly, we've talked to 18 key sector leaders that really have got sort of the ground truth thing that we felt we needed to bring to this. So, with that in mind, I'll turn over to Bill, who some of you may know from his days as Associate Professor at Lincoln University, or more recently as being on the Science Leadership Group of the Land and Water Science Challenge. Bill?
Right. Well, thanks, Todd, and thanks everyone for setting this out, for the introduction we've had. It's good to see everybody in the room today, and I think that speaks to the importance of the topic, this improving productivity and efficiency and the value add coming out of the New Zealand economy. The publication of the Institute of Directors boardroom has spent the whole last issue about productivity and has named increasing productivity as one of the top 5 issues facing the boardroom this year. So we know it's important. The Helen Clark Foundation engaged us to do this work. I'd like to thank them for that. It's been a great opportunity for us to reflect on the New Zealand economy and how to improve it. Oftentimes, we're working on small projects helping clients with particular problems, and this was a great chance for us to step back and look at the economy as a whole. But one of the difficulties with this kind of work is finding something new to say. We've known that there's an issue for decades. We've had these conversations about productivity for years. So how do we pick this up and try to say something new? And the Helen Clark Foundation was important for finding something new for 2 reasons. And the first one is that the foundation reached out to leaders in the food and fibre industries in ways that we wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. Productivity research often relies on official data statistics and data series to come up with answers. But by going and talking with the exporters to find out what they were thinking, to get their ideas and opinions about adding value to exports, we got some new ideas that added a new dimension to the work. The foundation also pushed us to offer some suggestions about actions that could be taken. And too often as economists, we like to talk about the problems. We'll tell you what's wrong, and then we'll leave it to you to solve that. But instead, we were really pushed to say, something new, and not just kind of a general statement about, well, businesses should do better, but actually what is a program that you could put in place next week? We were pushed to say that, and I think that comes out in the report. The report's better for that nudge. So what are those recommendations? Well, we focus on 5 areas. The first one is the workforce. When we talk about the New Zealand economy being more productive, we're really talking about people being more productive, about workers doing more in their businesses. In order to do that, they need the right skills, and those are technical skills and their soft skills. When we interviewed people from industry, they actually talked about the soft skills a lot, more than I expected. They talked about things like job readiness, the ability to work with other people in teams, and those are the kinds of soft skills that make a workplace work better. They also need technical skills, and they did talk about that, but that importance of soft skills was important for us to realize. I would like to point out that MPI has already been doing good work on that, on supporting the future workforce in the food and fibre sector. They've been doing work on forecasting labor needs. They've been supporting the program Muka Tangata, but more can be done, and we talk about it. The second area of focus is consumer-driven marketing, and we talk about this a lot when we talk about value add. Research has shown that New Zealand can get higher prices for its exports. We're already doing things in this country that overseas markets value, but we don't tell the story well enough. So one of the things we need to do is get recognition and price premiums for the kinds of things, the kinds of farming and production methods we're already doing. And in this area, we can look at climate-friendly practices and water quality actions not as costs, but as marketing opportunities. Can we tell those stories and get those price premiums? What we heard, though, by talking with people in industry, is that that kind of exporting is really hard. And this is one of the things in all of this work that we need to keep in mind. This isn't easy. We're not talking about just a quick fix. And one of the things they pointed out is that trying to do this is like setting up a mini multinational corporation out of New Zealand. You need all of those skills that a big international competitor has about consumer awareness and marketing, but you have fewer people and smaller budgets. One of the solutions to that is more and better collaboration within industry and between industry and government so that you can overcome some of these structural challenges. We know that New Zealand's long history of investing on farm has led to sustained productivity growth over decades on farm, but that hasn't translated out into the manufacturing and processing sectors. Because we haven't had that same investment into processing or into the services sectors, we're not getting that kind of processing innovation, product innovation, or business innovation. And that is something we've identified as a critical gap. The third area we talk about is risk and investment. It's common to say that New Zealand is capital shallow. We just don't have as much capital per worker. And the direct result is low productivity. That's a mathematical fact, really. So if you'll let me be an economist for a moment, the economy is a system of pushes and pulls that ends up at a particular equilibrium because of this play of forces. If you have a small capital base and you have the widespread risk aversion that you've got in New Zealand, you end up exactly where we're at. So the system is performing just as you would expect it to perform given the inputs into it. And that means in order to get something different, you've got to make a change. If we want something different, something in that system has to change. And that's an area for practical action. I'll mention 3, there are a few more in the report. One is government money is cheaper than private money. So is there a way to make targeted investment with cheaper money that overcomes some of these problems? A second area is regulatory risk. That kind of risk is one of the sets of risks that businesses have to deal with. And we know that regulations can change over time and businesses have to deal with that when they're making investments. So is there a way to reduce the uncertainty about regulations? And that's a role for government. And the third idea is more investment in research, science, and innovation. We know statistically that New Zealand simply invests less than other countries. It invests less than the recommended amount, both in the public sector and the private sector. So can we lift those rates to get more growth? This deficit over years has actually built up a massive deficit. So we need to invest more in order to overcome that deficit. The fourth area we cover is management and governance. Now what we've found is that this is an odd topic in the productivity literature. It's been recognized for years that management skills in New Zealand are, on average, actually not that good. There are pockets of international excellence in New Zealand, but on average, it's not that great. And yet, there's actually not been that many studies or that much research to try to solve that problem. We simply point to it. Some of the industry leaders we interviewed felt that, agreed with this, that management and governance skills simply aren't good enough to lift the productivity performance of the economy. And this isn't something just in the food and fibre sectors, it happens throughout the economy. So we've provided some suggestions across the economy for how to raise the profile of this issue and then work to solve it. And in that area, it's good to see that the Institute of Directors has raised this as an issue for this year. And then the fifth and final area is collaboration. We heard from industry leaders that New Zealand businesses waste a lot of time fighting amongst themselves rather than fighting their international competitors. And this is something you don't see as much in the productivity literature. This was definitely something that came out of our interviews with the industry leaders. Better collaboration could channel all of that energy towards competing on the international market. Now, this is a difficult area. If you do it wrong, you end up with monopoly and industry capture and all of those problems. But we have examples of doing it right. And can we build on those examples to improve the productivity of the economy? Already, there's been work on collaborative value chains to show how they can create better value and added value and increase productivity. So we need to do more work on that to figure out how to do it properly. So those are the 5 areas that we focused on. These are the topics that were suggested by industry leaders and identified through the prior research on productivity. With encouragement from the Helen Clark Foundation, we've offered some suggestions for how to make improvements. Now, we probably don't have those suggestions exactly right, but that's why we're putting this out. We've put out a discussion paper with some ideas, and we'd like to see those ideas lead to more discussion. If we get it wrong, but if we spark a discussion and you tell us, well, these are the 3 reasons why that won't work, then this report has done its job. This has been a challenging project. At its heart, the problem of productivity is figuring out how to make the country better for everyone, and that's a big topic. So we hope that this report is a useful contribution to that discussion. Thank you. Pass back.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Bill. We've got a couple of minutes before Paul joins us. So just a quick question from me. You mentioned widespread risk aversion. Could you explain a little bit more what you meant by that and whether you come up with any ideas as to what might mitigate that risk aversion?
So the risk aversion is, it comes through both in the literature and the discussions with industry leaders. And the idea is that we don't want to put money into something that's uncertain. We want a sure bet. And this is discussed as a cultural thing in New Zealand amongst business leaders. And part of the reason for that is there's not that much capital out there. So losing your investment capital is a big problem. There's also a bit of cultural problem where you lose status much more in New Zealand. One of the things the industry leaders talked about was bringing in more of that kind of let's try this out attitude from overseas. As an economist, I think also there are systemic problems, and if we can find ways to de-risk some of those investments, for example, by using cheaper government capital rather than private capital, then that's another solution to the problem.
Does anybody else have any questions for the team before we go live in a couple of minutes? You haven't had a chance to read the report yet.
One thing I'd ask is, you did mention about how New Zealand's export intensity is much lower than most people realise.
No, I didn't. I thought that would be a bit difficult to try to get across in a few minutes. But one of the things that we did in this report, again, after discussions with Peter, is we tried to, this is the wrong term, but correct the record a bit, or explain exactly where we sit in terms of productivity. One of the things that gets discussed, and again, this is actually in the Institute of Directors boardroom publication, it's often presented that New Zealand is falling behind in productivity. But if you look at the statistics, the issue is we fell behind 20 years ago. But actually, we've been keeping up with our position for the last 20 years. So we're kind of average to middling. Now, that's not bad. You know, it means we're doing good stuff. We're not doing great stuff. And getting that right, you know, this isn't about we're doing badly. This is about we're not doing excellent. So getting that right was part of what we want to do. And the other part of that was getting that idea about export intensity right. We think of ourselves as an exporting nation, but on the world stage, we're actually not. a big part of our economy is actually domestically focused. And so shifting that is part of getting that value add from overseas.
Yeah, so the size of the prize on that export intensity, if we were able to double export intensity, it's basically funding in another entire health system. That's sort of what's on offer there, so it's worth thinking about.
Okay, well, just while we wait for Paul to join, I'll ask you one more question. You talked about telling the story of our low emissions exports, and how do you think we could do that better? And I do work in the emissions area, and we do have a good story to tell at the moment. We might not always hold it. We're working hard to do so. But what do you think collectively? We talked about how companies compete with each other. Have you got any insights as to how we might collectively tell that story better?
So that's a communications and marketing question, and that's really not my area, unfortunately, but I can offer two ideas. So one is telling the story again and again and again. I happened to work on the Food Miles work 15 years ago, and I've been seeing in the press in Europe that same story coming out again about how, well, New Zealand's exporting this stuff, thousands of miles from overseas. This has to be awful for emissions. But in fact, we know that it's not. So coming back and just telling that story again and again and again with a couple of facts and figures is part of doing that. The other part is having that story collaborative and organized. And for this, I'd like to point to NZ Trade and Enterprise. When we talked with people, we found that NZ T&E had kind of two reputations with exporters. Some thought they were really good. Some didn't have any time for it. So that suggests to me that there's some work there that could be done in that key critical agency for New Zealand to get those messages right and collaborate with exporters.
Cool. I think Murray's just gone to see if we can contact Paul and get him online.
I'm happy to keep talking about this.
We might as well keep going while we wait. So, any other questions? No.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Paul, is that you online?
There he is.
That is me online. Hello, Helen. Good to see you.
Greetings, and thank you, Paul, for joining us. I think I should say to our audience that I got to know Paul in my time at the UN as a visionary business leader, chief executive of Unilever, obviously one of the world's largest goods companies, a huge brand, and one very committed to the new climate economy and how we do things differently in the planetary constraints that we face, and always one who was, prepared to put his hand up and back for the big international agendas that came out of the UN on sustainable development and climate action and biodiversity and so on. So really the epitome of the responsible business leader, if I could put it that way. So Paul and I have had a few words on Friday, just catching up on where we could take the conversation today. And Paul, we agreed we'd start on the international landscape and get you to outline a little bit how you see it with respect to transition economics, climate and biodiversity action imperative, sustainable production and business. And as you reflect on that landscape, maybe say a little about how you're seeing conversion to more sustainable food and fibre production around the world, and what is driving this? Is it the consumers? Is it governments? Is it investors? Is it company employees? Is it farmer and producers? Just tell us a bit about that international landscape as you see it.
I will, Helen, and first of all, thanks for getting up so early. It avoids me on this side of the ocean to go to bed late, so I appreciate that. And good to see you all, and the work you're doing with the foundation team and your report, Pathways to Prosperity, is welcomed, I believe, not only for New Zealand, but also for many other countries. 159 countries and at the COP28 in the UAE committed to deep decarbonization plans on food. Everybody realizes that we can't solve the climate crisis and the inequality crisis, if you want to, the biodiversity crisis, if we don't attack the food system. It's such an important part. And yet until now, it was mainly seen as an energy transition. But food is now firmly on the agenda. And I think you are the first one, with a few other countries, may I add, that is coming out with at least a good thought-provoking and good basis for discussion on how we need to transform our food systems. And frankly, not a day too soon. I think it's an important part of your economy, and you're an important part of making the global food system work, in my opinion, if you play it well and position yourself for that future. I mean, the world is not in good shape. We don't have to mince words around that. If you're a CEO right now, it's incredibly difficult and pulls you down to the here and now on many things, be it the geopolitical tensions that we have, the after effects of the pandemic, the economic situation, which is not very rosy, the effects on climate change coming through in every or nearly every business model now, and the list goes on. And yet we know that many of the issues that we're facing today is actually a direct result of not addressing the issues in the first place. Only 12% of the Sustainable Development Goals, which I had indeed the pleasure to help develop, are on track. Climate change and inequality, and with climate change I would say also biodiversity destruction, but these are actually the biggest issues that need to be addressed. And if we're not addressing it, we increasingly see it being played out in geopolitical tension at national levels, nationalism, populism, xenophobia, I believe undermining of democracy, I believe personally are a direct effect of us not getting grip of these issues. So it's absolutely important. The good thing is that with the Secretary General having had the Food Summit in 2023, was actually the first time that it elevated it to the agenda, to the global agenda, where people started to realize it's 30% of the problem of climate change. Think deforestation, think methane, think fertilizer, think degraded land. But interestingly, it's also 30% of the solution. And it is by all means possible, I believe, at least from the work that we have done, to create a food system that is frankly climate positive, nature positive, people positive, can feed the world, make it healthier for the citizens of this world, and doing that in a way that actually does not result in putting too much pressure on the prices that consumers ultimately have to pay. Now you might say that is too good to be true, and what I'm selling you or talking about now today. But study after study is starting to show that the costs that we are increasingly incurring in our terribly broken food system is becoming significantly higher than the benefits we can reap from changing that system. Currently, it's estimated that about $12 trillion of costs are incurred due to our broken food system in all elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. Were we to turn that around, we could turn that into a $4 trillion benefit. That makes it so attractive for business, by the way, because I believe to get the scale change that we're seeking, you need to have the economics work for you. And that's obviously why your study is coming at such an important moment. The food system permeates all of the Sustainable Development Goals, and we simply wouldn't get it back on track, or at least moving it back into the direction that we all aspire to, if we don't attack this food system. So high on the agenda now, increasingly important for some of the countries, and not acting anymore or keeping the status quo is simply not the option. In my native country, the Netherlands, we've seen what that did to politics. We're suffering from that even now. We're seeing it in the rest of Europe and increasingly in other parts of the world as well. Direct results, not of governments or of citizens, but a direct result, frankly, of the increasing costs that farmers are incurring as a result of climate change. And frankly, we'd be better off working together in this collaboration that your report talks about to move this forward. My final sentence would be, Helen, that I think New Zealand, a country obviously we all like, and many of probably my ancestors relations are sitting around the table as well, so I'm talking to family probably. But many of the vulnerabilities of the food system, I believe, are actually amplified in New Zealand. And if you don't take the lead and transform that system to a more value-added system, which you need for your aging population, for strengthening your economy, for making it, for attracting foreign direct investments, for making your export of the smaller country like you are, like the Netherlands, more robust and resilient. It leads you in all those things that undoubtedly the politicians must ask themselves. It leads you to changing the food system.
Paul, you spoke about food and fibre needing to be nature positive, climate positive, and of course the counterfactual is what happens if it isn't. And I wondered if you'd reflect a little on what the expectations are now of regulators and the markets that we're selling into. And I'm thinking EU, which is often at the advance of regulation around the climate, ecological space and the value chain. So what will regulators, buyers, consumers expect in the years ahead from food and fibre companies out of a country like New Zealand? You also spoke, when we spoke the other night, about being in Brazil and seeing the big Brazilian companies starting to pick up the signals from this as well. And in New Zealand, we're often accustomed to think, oh, well, we're a high income economy, we're better than them. But we're getting the sense that they're onto things that perhaps, we may not be as big an uptaker on. So taking all this context into account, what do we need to do to change, to stay relevant and prosper in the years ahead?
Well, there's without any doubt, I remember from my visits to both actually Australia and New Zealand, that sometimes it's a little bit farther removed from what happens in other parts of the world than would do you good. And things are actually moving. Companies are moving. We have 400 companies having made science-based targets and have approved as such on climate. We have many of the companies making firm commitments in their whole value chains on decarbonizing, including obviously on the deforestation side, but going well beyond that. And we've seen legislation coming in at a pace that probably is faster, if I may be honest, than we can all support, but it is there. We've seen the carbon border adjustment mechanism coming in Europe, which is important, the soil health directive in Europe, the EU deforestation law, the nature restoration law. We see the SEC in the US moving forward, California with stricter standards. We see the IRA actually as a piece of legislation where you might say, we were talking to Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, but it's probably $40 billion of incentives to drive our food systems in the US to more regenerative practices. So wherever you look at, you see the laws tightening, if you want to. And then on top of that, we actually, despite what people say about the climate, which has been a very difficult negotiation over the years, we're actually moving very fast on food. We have the Kunming Agreement, on which is conveniently called the COP15, which was in Canada last year, on protecting our biodiversity, the Treaty of the Oceans, the Plastics Treaty. We have come out of the UAE, as I mentioned, with quite some significant agreements from 159 countries to really build more resilient, sustainable, climate positive food systems. So the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, and the train has left the station, and it would be irresponsible to not be on that train, because if you're not at the table, soon you'll be on the menu in this case. So it is happening, and I think you'd be well advised to not only be part of these discussions, active part of these discussions, but actually also proactively shape it. It's very easy actually to see what is going to happen in the world, and on climate change, on biodiversity destruction. It doesn't take a CEO with more than high school, to be honest, to do that. The reality is we have the technologies. I would argue that we have the funds if we allocate them smartly, if we get rid of perforce subsidies that are still in too many systems, including 500 billion in agriculture currently, we have the proofs of these changes working for us. So it's time to go. And frankly, as we've seen with COVID as well, making changes to our food and land use systems are actually significantly lower in cost and higher in return. Some would say up to a 20 times return for every dollar invested. And that's obviously makes it very attractive. I just came back from Brazil. As you well know, Brazil has the G20 leadership this year, as well as the COP30 next year. And we're talking with President Lula or Finance Minister Haddad, or the governor of Pará in Belém, where the COP will be held, Haddad, and they're taking the food transformation, I would say, very refreshingly positive. We call it the ecological transformation plan, where with about $150 billion a year, they can transform their total industry in Brazil to a more sustainable, achieve the Paris targets, create 20 million new jobs along the way, which is very attractive to them, better jobs, and actually position Brazil as a very key player, not only in Brazil itself, doubling their GDP growth, but also amongst other nations, especially South-South. So we're very enthusiastic about that. Money is coming in now. Regulation is being put in place very fast. And you see tough industries, tough problems like the deforestation, the Cerrado, the beef industry. You see them quite eagerly wanting to be part of this because, frankly, their future depends on it. And I believe, Helen, as you say, that with some of the transformation that Europe is starting to see, albeit grudgingly, some of the changes that we're seeing in the US now, in Latin America, where Colombia and Brazil are probably leading in that respect, that you just want to be sure that you're not falling too far behind.
Thank you. Paul, you've had a chance to have a look at the Foundation's discussion paper that's out today. I wondered if you had any reflections on the issues and potential solutions it sets out, and any reflections on similarities with and differences from the challenges which the European food and fibre firms are facing and the solutions they might be pursuing to be more sustainable.
Well, the first thing I wanted to do was I saw this Maori proverb in one of the things I was reading, which says, He waka eke noa, which means we're all in this together. And I think this report that you did, the extensiveness of interviewing all the stakeholders, putting actually the farmer central, which I think we have forgotten in many of the discussions, but comes through in your report, is actually refreshing. I think what you're putting out there is in line with what you stand for, your values of inclusion or fairness or sustainability are really coming through. But I also think that it is a solution to some of the economic challenges that are creeping up to you. It's practical what you're suggesting. You have some inherent disadvantages based on your location, the structure of your industry, the absence of intermediate materials for added value. But some other countries in the region as well, Japan would be one example, have found ways to overcome that. If you invest in your human capital a little more, I believe, and you're clear on the direction you want to set, and not waver, which is very important for business, obviously, and then get the financing to flow, you can go quite far in your transformations. You're looking at quite comprehensively at all the areas that other studies have pointed out in terms of what the workforce needs, what type of products you need to put on the market, how you unlock capital to do this, etc. So the issues, frankly, are in some extent different because of more about your location and your demographics and your current actual problem of lack of scale, which has not given you champions. You have Fonteras, but you have very few that are really champions at a global level. And I think you'd be better off thinking about that strategically, just like some other countries have done. The excuse that I read somewhere that for the other countries it's easier, but because they're in Europe and part of a bigger trading zone, I think would be too easy to assume that. I think a strategy when you are a smaller country to create scale to compete globally, to create leading edge innovation and technologies, to be ahead of many of the other countries, is something that New Zealand ought to be able to do, in my opinion. So in terms of the lessons from Europe, which I would make very clear, is I have a farm myself in West Sussex, and we're converting, it's a dairy farm, by the way, and we're converting to regenerative practices there on a very fast basis, and actually are seeing the benefits from that, restoring biodiversity, seeing the benefits from that. But it's also clear that it simply wouldn't happen if we would not put the farmer central in all of this, and if we would not make sure that the economics for the farmer are better in the direction we want to take this than that they are currently. Half of the farmers in the UK are earning less than £20,000. In the Netherlands, it's not much better. 70%, 80% of European farmers can only exist because of subsidies. So if we make these transformations, we have to figure out other sources of income, like, for example, paying for services of biodiversity or restoring soil health and helping these farmers in that transition. The beauty is that study after study shows that with the effects of climate change really being there, that we can create more resilient and more economically attractive systems by converting to regenerative agriculture. But it's the transition economics. And a farmer that doesn't have any money, that only perhaps has 10 seasons left before he retires, given the average age of a farmer, is not going to take the risk. If the economics don't work for them, they don't move. And if they're then being told by governments, here are 1 million regulations, and from being a hero feeding the world to being a villain causing all the climate change, is not a constructive discussion to get the farmers on your side. So the main lesson from Europe, in my opinion, is how you tell the story, how you incorporate the farmers in the center of all you do, how you think about this just transition aspect that comes with it, and make that economically possible. Again, once more, it would get you faster to the results that you aspire to in your report, and it would be a lot cheaper than what some of the European countries are going through right now.
Yes, I think what you're saying resonates with some of the reactions here in New Zealand as well. As we see in the Netherlands, France, Germany, elsewhere, the farmer backlash. We've had our own groundswell movement here of people feeling that they're under a lot of pressure with unreasonable regulation and so on. And you're raising the issue of who really needs to bear the cost of the transition. How do we ensure that it's equitably shared? I mean, is this a resolved debate in Europe, or still one being worked through?
No, I think you have that same tension in New Zealand. If I would guess, between the urban and the rural areas, you have the same here. Farming is a politically very powerful lobby. There's still many smallholder farmers. They're proud to be 5th, 6th, 7th generation farming, like your own family. And they just don't want to be told what to do or told to close their farms all of a sudden, when, as I said, until now they've been celebrated for feeding the world. You know, people want to be treated with respect and dignity, and want to be included in these discussions. And I think, frankly, the politicians, be they in Europe or be it in some of the capitals of the individual countries, have really been a little bit distant from that reality. In Unilever, we would never put a product on the market without talking extensively with consumers and doing some testing. If you want to make these major changes in our food and land use systems, you have to reach out to these farmers and make them an integral part. In In the UK right now, where we probably are awaiting a new government, some people would say hopefully sooner than later, but leaving politics aside, we have had 4 or 5 meetings at my farm, because it's important to do it in a different setting than offices, where we have the national farmer unions and some others represented there. It's changed the dynamics of the discussion. Instead of finger pointing in the value chain, it built trust and makes everybody responsible. The major manufacturers of this world, the Unilevers, the Nestle's, the Danones, and all the other ones that you're familiar with, the Pepsis and the Mondeleses, they've all made Scope 3 agreements. And Scope 3 is your agriculture. They all want to go to green fertilizer. They all want to go to regenerative agriculture. They all want to restore biodiversity. And they're willing to invest. In fact, the top 5 companies right now, have invested 12 billion. We have a 20 billion fund that is coming up now in converting to regenerative agriculture. We're getting 500 million from Rockefeller, which a foundation that I'm on the board of. We're getting money from the Bezos Fund. Soon we have actually enough money, catalytic money, to help countries drive these conversions. And you want to be part of that. We talked with Ajay Banga or Kristalina at the IMF and Ajay at the World Bank, obviously, which historically has been giving very little money to agriculture. But now being aware of its bigger impact and towards the solutions as well, they're going to unlock more. And all that money is going to be catalytic. And it will attract private money and accelerate some of these changes. And you want to be sure that you get your fair share of this. It's, not to get into politics, but the Jeremy Hunt is here, the treasurer, was telling me we just don't have any money for the farmers right now, and politically it's not important. But we were showing to him with studies that we did that the unhealthy eating habits in the UK, that alone is costing $70 billion for the NHS. That is actually more than the money we need to transform and help the farmers. So we're at this point right now that is Peter stealing from Paul, and a good holistic strategy at government level is absolutely key. And I would be surprised if that weren't the case in New Zealand as well. And then we talk about the 500 billion per subsidies, which are frankly in every country still, that drive the farmers to the wrong practices. In the UK, for example, I wasn't aware of that, but there is no inheritance tax on agricultural land because you want to keep that together in these farming families, otherwise you have to sell. Land prices have gone up so much. But for example, forest is not classified as agricultural land. So the farmer would have to pay inheritance tax on that, which he doesn't have the money for. The only option he has is cut down the forest to make it agricultural land. Typical example of per subsidies that frankly was a surprise to the government. So I'm sure that if you look at that in New Zealand as well once more, you can unlock quite a lot to get you well on the way to where you want to be.
Paul, a last question from me, and that's on the role of leadership. How big a premium do you put on leadership for making the transitions that you're talking about, including in food and fibre production? And often when we talk leadership, we're thinking government leaders, but the role of business leaders is incredibly important, right? And are you encouraged by what you're seeing on either or both scores?
I have to say mixed. As we have problems with governments or multilateral institutions, we also have problems with businesses. I'm not going to be here and defending them fair and square because I've had my career in business. We have, but the issue that I've discovered is, or the thing I've discovered is, you only need 10%, sometimes less, of the people to do the right thing to create tipping points. With electric vehicles, that's 5%. With solar, we saw that at about 15%. Changing practices doesn't need everybody. It needs a few businesses to get together, to be responsible collectively, and to be first movers. And as they do it, they give governments courage to put the right frameworks or legislation in place and help de-risk that political process. And that's how you move. Ultimately, you cannot move to where we want to be at the speed and the time that we have, obviously, if we don't get the right regulations and the governments and policies behind that. That's a given. But it is business that actually has to help unlock that. And what we would argue in our book, Net Positive, you need to move to positive advocacy. Business all too often goes to governments to protect their own self-interest. Here, I think we have enough companies in major food companies that are understanding that this is a collective problem and that we shouldn't compete anymore in areas where the future of humanity is at stake. We've actually talked in this brief discussions, which I've enjoyed, about food security or biodiversity destruction or climate change. But these are actually not the problems. These are actually symptoms of a problem. And many people would say that the real problem is a problem of greed, of apathy, of selfishness. We know what to do. We have the technologies. We have the funding. The question is, do we have the willpower? And what we've seen during COVID is a bifurcation quite clearly in business models, where companies that were run under a multi-stakeholder, longer-term model, putting purpose in the core, embracing these partnerships, were doing better than businesses that were myopically focused on the shareholders. And we've also seen a bifurcation in leadership, where in very uncertain times, where very fast change, where pressure is enormous for everybody, anxiety is high, suicides, mental health issues. I don't have to tell you that the leaders who have a high level of empathy, compassion, who operate with a deep sense of purpose, think multi-generational, look at all of the stakeholders, including Mother Earth and as I said, future generations, that these leaders instill the highest sense of trust or confidence in their following and unlock a significantly higher level of engagement and action. So leadership is a differentiating factor increasingly. And in our book, we talk about some of the leadership traits that we need. But first and foremost, I think it is what I call courageous leadership, where we bring humanity back to business. Don't distill it to spreadsheets and numbers and I win, you lose, and computer trading and all the things that come with it. But bring the human side back to all we do. In climate change, we didn't start with the humans, and it gave us a problem to solve it in the time frame we have. At least the food system we can make human, and it is very much conducive to that. By the way, less politically polarizing as any other thing that we're working on. So courageous leaders are leaders that take a responsibility for the total impact they have in their world, not only what's under their control. Many companies still think they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibility. It just doesn't work anymore. Courageous leaders set targets that science tells you. Many companies still play not to lose instead of playing to win. It is uncomfortable to set these bigger targets. You might not have all the answers, but that's what courageous leaders do. They move themselves to this uncomfortable territory. And then it requires partnerships with your value chain across your industry and increasingly also with governments, which I know is uncomfortable. Don't tell me. I always say if you're suicidal, don't go to Brussels. But at the end of the day, at the end of the day, this is a problem that we cannot solve at the level we've operated on until now. That would be lunacy. We need to rise to that occasion. Wangari Maathai, who was the Nobel Prize winner from Kenya, said it very well when she says, in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to rise to a higher level of consciousness, a higher moral ground. I mean, that's what ultimately should drive us to do this, the responsibility that we have towards our fellow citizens, which are already paying a dear price to it, but also to the future generations that unfortunately don't have a voice in these discussions. So let's represent them. And then the leadership is being created starting with education. You know Judy Samuelson from the Aspen Institute. And I was talking to Judy the other day. I chaired a site business school at Oxford, and Judy was telling me, I have a nice piece of research for you. About 70 million people take business courses every year because everybody wants to go into business one day or another. But they were asked, why did they take MBA programs? Well, I want to change the world. I want to improve it. I want to make a difference. These same people were asked after they finished their MBA, what do you want to do? I want to work for Goldman Sachs, earn a lot of money, and win while the others lose. So from wonderful human beings in our education, we create little Milton Friedmans on steroids. It just doesn't make sense. So please don't do that in New Zealand. I love you too much for that.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, I'm going to hand over to Wayne, our MC, just to facilitate a bit of quicker audience interaction with you. Wayne.
Yeah, thanks very much, Helen, and thank you, Paul. Yeah, we have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask questions, please identify yourself and then ask your question of Paul. Thank you. Louise.
Good. Hi, my name is Louise Aiken, a partner at Deloitte here in New Zealand. Thank you, Paul. That was hugely insightful, and just by the amount of notes that I was seeing people take, it was there was a lot of really amazing things that you mentioned. We're really seeing with the growing importance of carbon disclosures, Scope 3 emissions, businesses requiring tangible and validated transition plans. We are seeing that the customer is becoming the new regulator. And I'm really interested from your point of view, what would you say out of all the things that you've shared with us today, what is the immediate action that you think, particularly our primary sector here in New Zealand, can do to respond to the customers, to the Danones, to the Unilevers, to the Nestles, to really secure our position as a sustainable agriculture supplier to the world?
I appreciate the question. Thanks for asking that, because that is important. At the end of the day, you are part of the value chain. You have to decide a little bit what is commodity and what can you decommoditize, and what do you need to do to stay in business in the first place. I think as you work this transition, the way I would think about it is to not be what you are currently, which is a commoditized B2B. And frankly, not much leverage. And the value that you're extracting versus the capabilities that you have is well below your potential. So you need to become a vital ingredient in the value chain. And companies would appreciate that. We are looking at agroforestry in Brazil, where we work with supply chains on cocoa and palm oil. And they go back to the farmer, source certified, biodiversity restorating, soil health restorating, livelihoods for these farmers. We can now disintermediate these value chains and bring them directly to the Tony Chocolonis in this world, and provide better value distribution, better transparency, what the consumers are looking for, and making these true partnerships instead of auctions. So you need to go into that direction. If you run your companies, I think on some of these things you need to go together. You are too fragmented still. I used to be on the one of the boards with Fonterra, and used to come to Auckland and visit your farms and your communities. And the cooperatives are great models, but they also have drawbacks. One of them being notoriously slow to change. So you need to think a little bit about the structure. If you talk about your dairy industry, you've been able to transform, by the way, from sheep production to livestock to some extent. But I think you need to go beyond that and think about this added value, what I talked. If you're now a company, I would first focus on your key emission hotspots. That's very clear. I would select the optimal mix of ingredients for your net zero recipe. I'll talk about it in a second. I would quantify your net zero business case very urgently, and nature positive, may I add to that, and treat it as a mission critical strategic issue for your survival, and then create the necessary systems change and forming these partnerships in the industry, but also with the government, where there hasn't always been consistency. Where I think New Zealand is very good, we have had, you have a blue ocean economy that is actually should be better than most countries in the world. There are some companies in New Zealand now and Australia that are working on seaweed. That is a significant methane reduction in cows, 75–80%, I've been told, in some of the testing, so that you can provide some solutions with technology. And that's very much, I think, what food needs right now. There hasn't been enough innovation in your sector in New Zealand. There hasn't been enough innovation and spending actually globally. The reason that the Dutch are the second biggest exporter is we have Wageningen as a university, which the government has always invested in. We have our research centers there. An ecosystem has emerged. You want to create some of that, and make that choice. So get to this higher value add and become the Intel inside of many of the products and create these different relationships with the ultimate producer of the brands. And frankly, if I may say, and this might not be popular for some people, disintermediate some of the value chain, because then the value itself will also be redistributed, and the farmer will be on your side for that transition.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Helen, I'll just pass back to you to thank Paul for his contribution today.
No, I'm enormously grateful to you, Paul, for joining our audience in Auckland and online today, and bringing all the insights you have from the international level, not only of business, but of interacting with the great global agendas of our time. So really appreciate that you've taken time out from farming in West Sussex to come and be with us today. Thanks so much.
For you always, Helen, and thanks for all what you guys are doing, and good luck on the journey. And if I can be any part of that to help you move forward, I'm here. I'm as much as you a New Zealander. I come from Old Zealand. Thank you.
So this brings our webinar to an end. So thank you everybody who attended online and in the room. We're now going to change to a round table. So the webinar is ending.